Hello. Today I want to bring a pair analysis video, which I haven't done in a while, but this is where I look at two hexagrams um, that are right next to each other sequentially, number-wise. Because the order of the hexagrams in all of the I Ching 1 through 64, the order that we most commonly use has a deep significance. There's a lot of intentionality to that sequence, and one of those intentionalities is these pairs that are next to each other that have sort of a story they tell as as a pair or a relationship that's sort of a duality. Some of them have different relationships to each other. They're not all identical, but they are meaningfully paired. So today we're looking at hexagrams 17 and 18. This is 17. It's called following. Most commonly, that's what I'm going to call it in this video, but we'll look at some other names and translations of its title. And repair also. We'll look at other names, but I'm going to call this one repair. And first, before I really dive into the analysis, I want to tell a sort of mythology, a story or mythology. This is a shamanic story. So there are tales of a shamanic poison, an ancient Chinese shamanic poison called the gu. And it's said to possess the power of killing its victim by driving them into a crazed state, full of delusions, false dreams, a sort of complete loss of reality. And the recipe for this poison is really simple. So you find a clay jar with a lid and you gather 5 poisoning creatures, a snake, a scorpion, a centipede, a gecko, and a toad. And you place all of these creatures inside that jar and you put on the lid and you wait. And you wait until one of these creatures has killed and consumed all of the others. And this remaining creature, you take it and you milk it of its venom. And that venom becomes this sort of spirit venom that carries the curse of the ancestors, all the ancestors who have been neglected, disrespected, who feel or have wishes to manifest ill will and misfortune to the children of the world. And that's sort of the legend of the gu. It sounds a lot like black magic, which is something I don't really believe in a real dark or black magic myself. To me, the idea of dark magic is a cautionary tale. It's a lore we've developed as a means for our imagination to traverse the abyss and liberate our souls from the suffering of the world. And so if I'm looking at this story or this legend of the gu as a cautionary tale, then I might begin to build a metaphor for what that means in terms of a teaching, right? What is it telling us? So let's analyze the recipe a little bit. Let's say that this jar is your mind or your heart or your soul, whatever it is you call your insides. And let's say that snake is all of your repressed desires. And the scorpion is anger and resentment. And the centipede is anxiety. The gecko is fear. The toad is shame, right? So, like, if all of these things that we all have inside of us all the time, actually, when they are truly just confined, and hid away, shut the lid, we don't look at them. These creepy crawly things, when they are bound in that way, they're gonna consume each other, like eventually. And it's a little consequential which one ends up winning, right? Which one gets to eat all of the others. Whatever comes out at the end is gonna be like this pulsing embodiment of toxicity. And so the gu is this uncontrolled, destructive manifestation of our shadow. It's a result of avoiding darkness and allowing it to kind of fester and consume us. So I hope you're asking yourself, what is the medicine or the antidote to such a venom as the goo. Um, and so just like the goo, this legend it sort of emerges out of ancient Chinese history, folk, and shamanic traditions. We also have the I Ching emerging out of this same tradition. And, I've been using it as sort of a guidance for navigating that internal landscape that is all of the creepy crawly things trying to consume each other. That's one of the prime ways that I use the I Ching in my own spiritual practice. And one part of my spiritual practice is this sort of process of analyzing the pairs, kind of a daily devotion to reading and studying this text. Um, divination is a part of it, but also just general study. And one of the first things I do when I'm doing a study of a pair is I look at the elements present, right? Um, Another thing I look at is the line relationships. And both of those things are actually really interesting in this pair, but let's look at it's one of them first. Let's look at the line arrangements. So what we have here in these two, if you're just looking at the lines, is this one is solid, broken, broken, solid, solid, broken, broken, solid, solid, broken, broken, solid. So you can flip this one over and oh wait, it's the same, right? So they have this flipped relationship with each other. That's called overturned. But also, if you were to make each line is the exact opposite of itself, right? So all the solid lines are changing into broken, and all the broken are every single line is changing into the other. And that is called opposite. Every line becomes its opposite, and you get this hexagram. There are only two pairs in that sequence that we consider the traditional sequence. There are only two in all of the I Ching. I think there's only two in all of the I Ching, regardless of what sequence you put them in, that have both of these relationships result in the same hexagram, right? So the other pair that's like this is 11 and 12, harmony and stuckness, which I have done an analysis for. There's no other pair in the I Ching that has both overturned and opposite end up resulting in the same hexagram. That's really interesting. And what that says to me is that these concepts that we're analyzing together of following and repair, they both complement each other and oppose one another. And as with most sort of really seemingly irreconcilably contradictory things in esoteric philosophy, if you come across something like that, it's almost always a key to unlocking a mystery. I'm not going to pretend I've actually unlocked the whole mystery. I'm not even going to try to dive into asking what that mystery is that I'm actually looking at yet. I'm just going to keep going through my process with you in this video on how I do an analysis, right? So the next thing I usually look at, I'll get into the elements here in a minute, but let's look at the names, right? So I told you that I'm calling this one following, but there's many names, right, that other people have used when they're translating the title of this hexagram. And since I don't speak Chinese, I like to find as many names and look at them as I can. And so the names for following are according with, acquiring followers, adapting, adjusting, accompaniment, concordance, natural attraction, inevitability, inevitable, and influence. So you get a little bit of nuance there when you read all those names, but you also get like a general sense of like this easy flowing, following sort of vibe, right? This energy that is following. And what elements we have in this hexagram are, you'll see we have fire and water. Water is over fire. That's a little bit curious because what happens when you put fire beneath water, right? The logic would say that, they just eliminate each other. The fire is extinguished and the water is evaporated. And at the very least, the water cools the fire and the fire warms the water a little, maybe. Um, and I always kind of try to attempt before reading a bunch of other people's commentaries to derive what sort of essential movement or energy or change is being called on by this hexagram, by these elements as they interact with each other, right? So what do they evoke in me? And so I think of the concept of, maybe it's a boiling pot of water. You have the fire beneath the boiling pot, and the fire is causing that sort of bubbling up of energy. And does that relate to the idea of following? I'm not sure. Another thing that comes to mind is sort of like that sound you get when you like toss some water onto a fire and it just goes out quickly. This very quick release, just right. So those are the energies that just come to me with this. However, if I do read a translation or a commentary, for example, Wu, his translation of the advice to the superior individual for this hexagram says, the Junzi retires toward the twilight of the day. And that's a little like, how does that reconcile with the idea of water and fire and following? It brings to mind, and what I actually drew in my card here is a sun setting over a lake. So in this case, the fire element is a reflection of the sun that becomes the fire because, sun is its own element in the I Ching. But we're talking about little fire, not big fire. And so it's a reflection of itself, or the sun is moving down the sky and will soon be actually beneath the lake, right? And we actually get this image when we watch a sunset of the lake sort of bursting into light or looking like it's on fire for a brief moment before darkness. So that imagery all comes to mind and sort of sits with me a certain sort of way. I want to look at 18 for a minute. So this is our corresponding hexagram for the pair, which I'm calling repair in this video, but other names for this one are destruction, decay, fixing, rectifying, degeneration, misdeeds, corrupting, renovating, plague, pestilence, poisonous, and defiled. The idea of the goo is heavy here, right? And we have earth over air, which, just to point out, we now have water, fire, earth, and air. All four of the terrestrial elements are present here. So in this case, earth over air, the mountain, that earth element is a mountain, becomes kind of that container, that clay jar that we keep the goo in, or that is sort of this channel that if you think of wind blowing through the mountains become this sort of channel that the winds are really forcefully going through, right? Think of how the trees become very dwarfed at the top of the mountains where the wind is really heavily bearing on them, and how a canyon, which is this jagged gorge carved out by water, actually gets very softened and smoothed by the wind. It clears away all of those jagged edges. And the image description text here is the wind blows down the mountain. And so there's this sort of apparent relationship or duality you can see here of something that's really slow, easy, natural, and flowing, and something that's violent and destructive. That's sort of the polarity we see with these two. And then, like I said, we have all four of those terrestrial elements present. And that's not always the case either. Like that happens a few times. Sometimes we're just, when we get a pair of these, we're kind of just looking at two elements, right? Or three. Or those elements are mixed between celestial and terrestrial. But having the four terrestrial, earth, air, fire, water, together in this pair implies that there's there's an activity of heavy balancing of scales, right? Absolute balance, balance of the energy. In fact, so like all of these elements seem to be extinguishing or stopping, or they're all kind of an anti-venom, right? Clearing away. And there's this just wiping each other out almost kind of quality happening here. So what is that polar dynamic and that eliminating quality teach us in this pair about how to cure the goo? That's a question I have. So one of the first things I think about with the idea of following as a force of change is that it's a double-edged sword, as is the case with many hexagrams. You can see the two sides. There's the duality of the pair, but then there's always the duality of the one change idea itself, right? So in the case of following, it can be either the source of this poison, the goo, or it can be a path to healing the poison. And so bringing back this mindful to mind the sunset images, I would encourage you to think of a time in your life when the sun set, but you felt your work was not over, like you had to burn that midnight oil, or you had miles to go before you sleep. What's guiding that feeling that you can't sleep yet, like you need to do more work? Um, the commentaries for this hexagram speak of being aware or questioning what you are following. So it's likely that this full night of labor is guided by something. And was that something within you? Or was it a necessity for survival? Was it guided by expectations of others, such as parents, work, or culture? When we follow blindly without awareness, we can fall into a false reality, a prison that can be created by this sort of mental goo, right? This sort of consuming of all of these shadows within us, really busily at work, right? Clouding clarity and reality. So that's one side of this idea of following, the polarity that is following, um, is that defaults, right? Those things we fall into that we feel as though they are inevitable, which is another title for this. Those inevitabilities can be deadly poisons, right? What is the other side? So there is this healing balm as well to following, right? And that's the kind of following that involves setting aside your ambitions, setting aside thoughts and expectations completely, and allowing yourself to be moved by something, allowing a profound truth to penetrate you, this sort of full surrender. There is a paradoxical freedom that comes, that sort of comes from letting go of the hold you have on yourself, on your sense of who you are, especially if that sense of self is becoming sort of smaller, this little tiny container like a jar, right? Um, and sort of when we discover what we're really truly meant to follow, whether that's a value or a deep truth or the times and the seasons, what what feels natural, that then we no longer really have to worry about what should be done at the end of the day. Then it's hard to tell the difference between following and resting peacefully, peaceful resting. Hence the energy of retirement of the sun setting. When we are in the Tao, the work feels like rest. So that teaching kind of helps us heal the goo, is that search for that kind of awareness of what we are following, the paths that are natural and life-giving, rather than corrupt and poisoning. Hexagram 18, on the other hand, this one is the corruption or the poison itself, the goo, the pain. The process of repair, which is what I'm calling this one, starts with becoming aware that we are following something corrupt or poisonous, right? But we have to follow it, right? We have to face it in order to find it and heal it. So it's an intentional following of the pain, not an unaware, unintentional following of this sort of default suffering, right? Because, so in that case, the that earth energy, that jar, right? It becomes the jar that's holding all of the creepy crawlies, right? Because when we can put them all in a jar, we can focus on them and really look at them. And the air element is this force that sort of blows in, clears out the corruption in order to make room for new growth. It blows that container into shards. It turns that mountain path into nothing but dust. So where there is pain and suffering, follow that for a minute. And by following it, I don't mean wallow in it, right? I mean stalk it like a hunter who becomes their prey. Like they get into the mind of, they completely follow in the footsteps of, they immerse themselves so completely that they learn the deep, dark woods in a whole new way. Hexagram 18 repair is the hunt for corruption. It's the hurt. That hurt that is the burrow of the prey. It's where it is hiding. So feelings, specifically suffering, are windows to understanding where there is something poisonous that needs to be treated. Hexagram 18 repair teaches us that the antidote is the process of confronting the goo, clearing away this corruption that's taken some roots, right? Because when we are willing to look at that darkest thing that we can possibly ever imagine, and we look at it directly in the face, we turn towards it and allow ourselves to be curious about it, then we are given a gift of sight. We can finally see the thing that needs healing. And so the advice that these two give us is to sort of dissolve this amalgamated, creepy, crawly, gooey creature, dissolve it, and follow new ideas with complete surrender. Give in to what feels true and natural, and courageously confront and clear out what's corrupt. That nature, that truth, that kindness, those things allow us to take rest and sort of following the Tao, I think, is the idea we have here. And so that's what I took from my pair analysis on these two.